Welcome to Business Class, a podcast for people wanting to upgrade their thinking, upgrade their learning, and upgrade their life. I'm your host, Eugenia Panderhos, founder of Business Class Collective, best-selling author, and life coach. If you're an entrepreneur, a startup, or someone who dreams of reaching their full potential, then you're in the right place. You'll feel empowered and inspired to design the life you've always wanted. Let's do this. Hello and welcome to the show. I hope you've had a wonderful week. Mine has been productive and enjoyable. And just yesterday, I enjoyed a long lunch with people from academia where we discussed a whole range of topics. It was really quite interesting because everyone was from different walks of life, but sharing knowledge around a table over a delightfully prepared lunch was absolutely amazing. Later on in the evening, I went to a lecture at University of Adelaide, and it had to do with ancient female philosophers, some of whom have been lost along the way, but it was a lovely reminder about the role that women had in philosophy and in thinking, and in particular in the era of Plato, and some were students of his. So it was quite interesting and inspiring, and I just feel like there's always been women throughout the ages who've made a difference in the lives of others and who teach on virtues and morals, and others who are scientists and astronomers, and it was really just quite fascinating. The other news I have is that I've been accepted into a mentoring program for entrepreneurs who are navigating their way in growing their business, and I've now been allocated a mentee. It's always a good idea to give back and to share knowledge and experience, so I'm really looking forward to this journey. Since launching the first interview with Dr Adam Fletcher, I've received some amazing feedback, and I'm thrilled to be bringing you the second part of the trilogy, or should I say the epic conversation where Adam continues to inspire and enthrall us with his unique blend of knowledge and wisdom. So let's get started. Adam, we're discussing the GFC and COVID and the impacts that had on business in general worldwide and the decisions that you made in your business. So is there anything else that you wanted to share about that?
I was very clear at the time that people needed us more than ever when those big crises hit. There were genuine stresses affecting sleep, affecting staff, affecting awareness of risks, risk-taking, etc. And that's part of what we specialised in, helping people manage. But those times of crisis were times when our customers actually struggled to get the financial support to actually get us to help them because finances were just locked down. And that was interesting, frustrating at times, but understandable in a way too, because when a crisis hits, we generally fall back to our most recent concrete stage of development, and it's often closer to survival than long-term planning. And so for anyone who's a student of human development or societal development, it's not that surprising that even though we had customers that previously we'd been in conversations about long-term future strategic plans, when a big crisis hit, everything's about survival and compliance, and everything else is just pruned off. And so there's very little we could have done about that. We certainly fielded a lot of phone calls to say we need you more than ever, but we just can't get anything across the line. Hope you survive this and hope you're still around when we come out of this. So, very tough times for everyone. We obviously made it through, but we made it through, I think, because we were so conservative. We always banked profits rather than paying them out. There was never pressure, to do otherwise. There was no other shareholders to push me to be otherwise. So I think, if it wasn't for those two things, we wouldn't have survived probably one or both of those big global events. So, I think it's a testament to conservatism and a testament to long-term human-centered values.
And strategic thinking, having autonomy and agency over your business, and being able to be that person that you're that go-to person. People calling and contacting and needed the help that they desperately needed, and working in different circumstances now, working from home, working with children and families and educating their children at home. It was like a perfect storm when it comes to sleep, fatigue, mental health, and let alone what happened in Victoria. For our international listeners, we had an entire state lockdown for
the best part of 2 years, really.
Unprecedented, unheard of, perhaps one other city in the world, but the cost of that was phenomenal.
Especially on healthcare workers and paramedical, because they were pushed to wear way more protective equipment than would be normal for a lot of tasks. That alone is very demanding and draining. There were often less people available because they were either off sick or they were fired for not fulfilling mandates of vaccine requirements, or they were otherwise not available for the roster. So you had less staff doing more work under more demanding workload pressures and under a lot of stress. And for a lot of that, there was no end in sight, really. So, extremely, extremely tough for a lot of those frontline workers and anyone associated with that ecosystem.
Yeah. And on the business front, I mean, we got through that. We got through all the JobKeeper and all the reporting that needed to happen in order to survive those times, as every other business in Australia was dealing with at the time. So I think it comes back to the team that you have, the systems, the processes, the leadership, the vision. Even when everything's blurry inside, you kind of find
the trust as well. The trust that what's being said can be relied on. The trust that if someone says something, they're going to do it. They'll do it. Those sorts of things. Those real intangible things become extremely important to have.
Yeah, it becomes paramount because that you've got each other's back, and that the vision is greater than the sum of the parts, if you like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it's intangible. You can't. How do you value it? How do you, touch it or hold it? It's just Yeah,
you can't, and it's lost in the spreadsheet of the financial running of the business. It's lost in even the risk management tables and spreadsheet a lot of the time. It's very much a subjective or felt thing, but it becomes paramount, as you say, in those times of crisis.
And I think, Adam, I'm really proud of the way, as a business owner, as someone who's worked in your business with a team, how we navigated all of that. Looking back, I knew it at the time, but looking back at how we navigated that, it's something I'm really, really proud of. And really,
thank you. And look, I 100% agree, and I have a high confidence that if you went and did a quick survey of pretty much anyone who was in or working closely with the business through those times, I'm quite confident that everyone would be extremely grateful for the transparency and the flexibility and the humaneness of the approach that we always took.
So there are external forces that, impacted the business. And then I think about perhaps the personal ones that I've gone through with the loss of my parents and a breakdown of a marriage, that having the trust and the respect and the understanding and the flexibility allowed me to complete my role in the best capacity I could under the most extenuating circumstances. And I know how rare that is. And that's not lost on me. That's something I'm very, very grateful for the culture in the business, because culture is another thing it's intangible. It's either created or it's depleted, and it can take one person to ruin something that's been great for a long time, but it takes everyone to keep it together. I think there are more internal staff impact events, if you like, that also has an impact, but flexibility made it possible through the obstacles and the challenges and completing tasks and my
Yeah,
role.
absolutely. And I think, as the old adage goes, trust is earned slowly and eroded or destroyed, rapidly. And I think that's a two-way street. I think people should be able to earn the right to have flexibility. And for me, it was never around FaceTime or being in the office. It was always about, well, is this person delivering what I need from them, in a reasonable time frame, etc. And if the answer is yes, then in my view, that means that flexibility should be there. I mean, it is easier in smaller businesses. As a business owner, I could really have a pretty real-time sense of where things were at. More difficult in very large businesses because you just probably can't keep your finger on the pulse like you can in a small business. So, and other businesses too, if you've got lots of junior people who don't necessarily have the experience of being productive in these remote and flexible environments, that adds another layer of complexity. But yeah, we're very fortunate. We had a smallish team, highly professional, highly committed, and we could make sure that it worked.
Adam, you've had some highlights in your life. What have been some of the most memorable highs?
Yeah, I'm probably better able to see them now. I mean, a lot of the time has sort of passed. It's made me clearer about what the real adventures and highlights and fun parts were. For me, I think the biggest one was realizing that I and we had the capacity to transcend cultural differences with the work that we were doing. We published a scientific paper about that years ago now, following a set of projects that we did in Borneo, really the Indonesian part of known as Kalimantan. I think I travelled there about 12 or 15 times over a few years for a very large mining company project and a couple of ancillary projects with their contractors and others. And it was a hugely demanding process. Every time I went there, these sites were in the very, very middle of the jungle in an underdeveloped pre-project environment. So, we would have to literally get planes, boats, four-wheel drives, helicopters in and out of a lot of places. We would often have to meet with the village leadership simply to be able to be there and or talk to people. That was very humbling, and yeah, I was very grateful for those opportunities to really ask firsthand what was important to the village and the leaders and the people, to really help understand the language and the concepts and the worldviews of what was important for them, because safety is a universal. Wanting people to go to work and come home safely is a universal. But with the right intent, we were always able to find a common ground and to be given the opportunity to learn the language and the concepts and the worldviews across the world in many, many different cultures relating to many, many different industries was a real gift and a real pleasure. And it was extremely complicated, but we did, I think, a very good job of that. And probably the biggest lesson I learned there was to hand it all back, because I did see on my travels very well intended, very well resourced, usually Western experts leave a difficult wake for the people left managing the responsibilities. And I saw it a lot with medical teams. They'd come in and they'd do genuinely miraculous things and then disappear. And then I'd hear about people being uncomfortable or lacking confidence about their local medical and nursing and paramedic people, when actually they were extraordinary. And so, seeing some of the ways it shouldn't be done really helped forge my commitment to empowering local people and giving them the tools and the language and the confidence to drive these things themselves, and to not position us as these white knight experts, but just bring us in as a facilitator for discussions to be able to share knowledge, them about cultures and practices in our direction, and us about perhaps some practical scientific things in the other direction, and really position everything as a partnership that they owned and they were left with. You know, for me, that was the most satisfying thing. It could have been, oil and gas facilities in West Papua or in the North Sea, mining in Borneo or Chile, airlines in Brazil, France, Australia, Vietnam, you name it. It was, you know, if your intent is good and the humanity of things like sleep and safety and care is at the core of what you do, then lo and behold, you find middle ground. And I think we did a great job at that, and that was very satisfying.
Something you should be very proud of, Adam. And it's about having the conversation and meeting them where they're at and empowering them to take the action needed.
Yeah. 100%. And I think it's important for all of us to not ever be arrogant enough to think we know better than someone who lives, works, and has grown up in a specific culture, be that a country's culture or an organizational culture or an industry culture. I mean, none of us are bigger than all of that. You know, it's the local people that are the experts in that. And sure, you can add value by facilitating and proceduralizing and monitoring, absolutely. But it's important that the ownership is local.
That's where real change happens. What sets you apart in your industry?
I'm probably the worst person to ask that too. I don't know. I think that sense of care is pretty widespread. I come across it everywhere I go. If my approach is clear about humanity first, people first, then it's amazing how quickly my kindred spirit come out of the woodwork and want to sign up and want to participate and want to be encouraged through their own challenges to be local leaders. And so I think being able to, have that invitation be legitimate and have it able to be received at a local level across cultures and industries and countries, etc. I think that's a skill I didn't realise was so unique at the time, but in hindsight, I realised that was our superpower, really. It's very rare, from what I'm told, to be able to bridge all of those things together and deliver them in the way we did. Some people are absolutely expert at the biology or the molecular or the business process flows or the IT monitoring systems of data, but to bring it all together in a coherent, practical, human way, I think that was probably what set us apart the most.
And I think people feel heard and understood, and that builds the trust and the bond for bigger things. And I think you're very good at that, Adam. You're very, very good at allowing people to be heard, and you would be understanding them from their point of view and facilitating. I think they're the two things, really.
There's a big relief too. I think it's such a relief for someone to allow things to be the way they are, where we're actually allowed to talk about what goes wrong when people fall asleep or if people get distracted or just get bored or whatever. Like, if there's too much automation and people are falling asleep, we need to have an honest conversation about that. If people are too overwhelmed because the workload's not realistic or it's unclear because it's not proceduralized and monitored, like, they're all real problems. So I think there was a lot of relief when people realised we were having a real conversation. We weren't trying to use risk management to justify unacceptable practices or pretend like one layer of what was important was the whole picture. And so, relief was probably the other thing I saw more and more and more, and at all levels of the organisation, with frontline people, with unions, with management, with executive, with board members, to have people realise that they were invited to a proper conversation, not a corporate justification, was huge.
I love that. A real conversation, not a corporate justification. Yeah, how powerful is that?
Yeah, extremely powerful. It was often a shock too. It was often a shock to people like, oh, this isn't the normal conversation. This isn't the normal platform. This is something else. I need to sort of sit up in my seat and pay attention. And maybe I even need to be courageous enough to participate and vocalize my experience and contribute to making our system better instead of just sitting back, rolling my eyes and assuming it'll go into a black box and no change will happen like usual. It's just the flavor of the month or whatever. Like, that was a surprise in a lot of cases.
Yeah, what a delight, because that's part of being heard, seen, appreciated, understood, and wanting to find an outcome that's suitable. Fantastic. And looking back at all that you've achieved, what has been the main catalyst that's allowed you to grow or pivot in life and in business?
I think I'm just really fortunate that I seem to be wired to be curious and a lifelong learner, as you said in the last episode. I've always had that sense of curiosity. I'm always interested in the dynamics of things rather than sort of everything being fixed. And it means that I can break things down to initially just observe and learn, but also in times of challenge and crisis, it also helps to extract the lessons and integrate them and iterate the algorithm for what's coming out next. And I think that's really wired. I never sort of sat on my laurels and assumed that something was concrete or fixed or never changing. I was always keeping an eye open for the change. And I think that, that's probably been influenced by a lot of my personal practices and development as well. I think, in a lot of early martial arts work that I did, we were always trained to be mindful of the peripherals. And I think in spiritual practice, be it meditation or other activities, there's a sensitivity to the wider scope and bringing beginner's mind, as is often quoted. There's one thing for sure, which is that if you're 100% certain about something, you're 0% open to other learning. And I feel like I've always kept myself humble enough, partly through being knocked down, but partly through being just curious, to really keep that beginner's mind as best as possible and integrate those new dynamics and new variables and other things as they presented themselves, or at least as I became aware of them.
Yeah, I think it's critical, Adam, like continued learning through life, informally, formally, from peers, from friends, from strangers. If you have that open mind, you're continuously learning and you don't know when you're going to need that lesson.
That's right. And it's brutal. It's brutal and crushing for the ego to realise how little you know about something when those big lessons and opportunities come. And so I think there's another layer of value in that. Like when you're really raw and honest about how much you missed and how much you've got to learn, then it's very humbling, and that itself adds another layer of value as well.
Keeps you grounded. When you're grounded, you can pivot.
Yeah.
What are your benchmarks for success? It might be profit, customers, client base, public speaking, publications, accolades, awards, but what's your personal benchmark for success?
Yeah, I'm glad you described all of that because, of course, in the different worlds I've worked and still work in, be that universities or consultancies or other things, they are defined very, very differently. But framing it as a personal question, it sounds very trite and overused, but it really does come down to integrity. We need to be able to tell people if something's changed, even if that's going to be a disappointment. We need to not take things on if we can't deliver it extremely well in the time frame and budget required. And we need to dig deep and get it done, even when things change, to make sure that we deliver it and do what we say we're gonna do. And that's internal, that's external, that's personal. And that doesn't mean it's done 100% of the time. That's part of those sort of crushing lessons that can happen from time to time when you realize that, yeah, I've taken on too much. Something's got to give. Can I delegate? Can I delay? You know, or do I have to cop something on the chin? Or does something have to give personally or whatever? Like, they're really tough. But yeah, those difficult conversations and that raw honesty, to have the integrity to just see things through at a high level and or communicate when something's not possible. To me, I think that's the core of it. I mean, it's sitting inside of the original intent, which is around human health and human thriving and human safety. So that's interconnected to it from a context point of view. But yeah, I think that's the core issue.
There's so many different benchmarks to success, but I think, yeah, integrity is key. It means that whatever relationship you're in, if you say what you're going to do and do what you're going to say, make all the difference to building the trust, building the can-do attitude. And as you said, tweak it as you go along if you have to. But as long as pure intent is there in the first place. But sometimes, you can find people that between intent and delivery, it's huge, it's huge gap, and you don't want to be the person that's going to fall short, without doing
it's a good point, really, because I think there's a parallel with like boards and sort of the big pointy ends of businesses, because often people who are great strategically aren't great at execution, and that happens at other levels and scales of businesses too. And I think, in my experience, there are people that are great at execution and delivery that wouldn't really be in any way visionary or strategic, and vice versa. And I think it's really important for the kind of work that we did that we could hold both. We could hold the tension of the strategy versus the execution and vice versa, and talk coherently about it in the language of the people that were our audience in that moment. So it could be financial and risk management language and processes and methodologies at the board and the executive level, but it's about like practical personal strategies and tactics and doing things proactively and reactively in my own personal time and at work to really protect my alertness, protect my safety, protect my health, and thrive and be productive and, have the energy to do what I want to do at work and outside of work.
Yeah.
So I think, you're right. And I think that scales up from the very smallest single person scale all the way up to the board overseeing the entire thing, however big it is.
Yeah. And then there's the loose, tight boundaries around that. So sometimes you need to bring things right in and be laser focused and say, this is what we're going to do. And then other times in that strategy or delivery, you can loosen it a bit and make it malleable for the delivery, for the benefit, for the outcome. So, there's just so many layers to, how do we, what is the benchmark of success? Because it varies along. But at the core, it's integrity.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, everything comes from that. How do you stay motivated?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think it is about intent. It's about having clarity around what my intent is, even when I don't feel like doing something. If I can reconnect with my intentions, if I can reconnect with my aims and goals, then usually that's enough to just get me moving and keep me adding value, even if I don't otherwise feel like it. That's almost like kind of overriding the sort of conscious decision that would otherwise happen and just go, no, that's not an acceptable result today. We've got this bigger picture goal or intent. Remember, that's more important than your energy levels today. That's what keeps me motivated. And of course, there's another side to that spectrum too, about slowing myself down or stopping myself when I'm pushing too hard. And that was a very hard or very slow lesson, I think, for myself to learn. I was always very good at driving and pushing, driven by curiosity and solving some of these complex puzzles and, money and other things. And then eventually, as time rolled on, some of the early priorities weren't there anymore, and it more came about contribution and helping support development of people and creating longevity rather than immediate value. And, in all of that, I could push myself too much, too far. And, that had consequences on health and relationships and other things over the long term. But I think they're part of the same dynamic. It's about trying to keep in the sweet spot, which means, cracking the whip and getting things moving on a day that I might otherwise not feel motivated. But it's about giving myself permission to rest and recover and be more balanced and have more fun when enough's enough on the work front or the business front for a time.
Yeah, having that awareness is so important. So, as you remember your why, so your why is going to be the reason you get up and your vision and your mission. Equally important, as you said, is knowing when to stop, when to take a pause. Because, there's power in the pause. You process differently during that time. When you've given yourself permission to slow down, you can see things a little bit clearly because you're not in the weeds.
That's right. Absolutely. And that's relevant almost regardless of your role. I mean, if you're in a more physical, manual labor type task, if you don't have that awareness, you are drifting into a risky zone and you're probably not aware of it until something goes bang. So, from a personal safety and system safety perspective, it's really beholden on us to have that level of awareness that sometimes we need to stop. Sometimes we need to rest. Sometimes we need to recover. And you and your family and your system depend on that. And so I think that's true at the organisational scale as well. And it's true on the other side of the spectrum where sometimes you've got to push things harder than they've been pushed and find safe ways to do that. But it is a universal, everywhere I've been in the world, it's very clear to me that people really, really value safety and want to feel safe. It's a universal human trait and value that I've observed and felt. And the only exception to that is if people feel like things are being over proceduralized or crimped or the flow is broken somehow. So, we can over protect and over systematize and over proceduralize and sort of make the flow reduce. And the safety kind of then just becomes a bit compliance driven and doesn't feel right. So to me, that's a big and critical balance. It's like you need the sufficient level of system, but you need to make sure you're keeping people safe as well. And there's a tension in that, and there's a dynamic in that. But everyone wants to feel safe, but no one wants to feel over proceduralized. And that's a trick too.
Yeah, that's a balance. There's inertia that comes into that. People get tired. That actually can make people tired and fatigued and mentally drained. So I think you're right. By having that sweet spot between how valuable are the procedures for the sake of procedures and sleep and fatigue, as opposed to this entire volume that causes fatigue if anyone ever wanted to know how to do something completely correctly.
Absolutely.
A story that comes to mind is I met this lady who was a retired doctor, and this is pre-mobile phones, and she had been on a shift at the hospital. She drove home to only find her husband greeting her at the driveway saying the hospital just called, there's an emergency, you've got to go back. She went back, and she's working like a double shift. And she was crying telling me this, and it happened like 30 years ago. And she still feels it today because she says she can't remember how she got home. There's no memory. And she knows she drove home, but she actually has no memory of how she got home. And I think the realisation of going to work and home, not remembering how she got home, and she got home safely, thankfully, it stayed with her. And it's kind of like this emotional baggage that she has about that particular incident. And that's an example where procedures that work and protect staff would be great, as opposed to the procedures that can cause other inertia and disconnect and overwhelm.
Yeah, definitely. And procedures is a great example, but it really is often only one layer of a system as well. So there might be monitoring that's another layer. But these intangibles we talked about before, like culture too. I had quite a few shocking stories come to me in the early stages of me working on the clinical side of the sleep world in the hospital. I had more than a handful of truck drivers, predominantly, a train driver in one case, all male, all overweight, all unhealthy, who had fall asleep accidents in their workplace. With the truck drivers, they predominantly had serious accidents, like crashed the truck, rolled the truck kind of situations. We were treating them for obstructive sleep apnea. I would often see them again after treatment, and there was like miraculous improvements in their awareness and alertness and just general general health as well. And that was a big gift to me, because these people would tell me what they were aware of and what they weren't aware of in the minutes or hour before the crash. Most of them didn't recall big blocks of time. They were pretty much always aware that they were getting sleepy. They were pretty much always aware that their eyes were drooping and their head was nodding. And we've got to listen to those early indicators if we're driving or working. They were all aware of those things. That little voice in our head that says, "Oh, it'll be all right," or "I'm nearly there," or "I've got to get there, I'm running late." Like, that little voice is impaired.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing pretty much for anyone to be aware of is, if we're tired, if we're fatigued, that little voice that chimes in and jumps in at those times, that's a flawed consciousness. It's an impaired consciousness. You don't listen to that voice. If you're getting a head nod, if you're getting a slow, long eye blink or a micro sleep, or you realise that you were distracted or somewhere else for a significant block of seconds, find a safe place to stop. Find a safe place to pause as quickly as possible. Because all of those people I spoke to heard those voices, were reassured by them, and then fell asleep or had some other significant lapse and then had major accidents. And these were the lucky people. If you crash a truck, you're way more likely to survive than the person they hit head on who's in a car or on a motorbike or on a push bike or something. And so, yeah, that was a real gift, a real eye-opener as well for me. And also just landed me in the reality of what I was actually working in. It could save lives. I've no doubt it did save lives.
Fascinating. I remember driving to the York Peninsula one day and feeling really tired about halfway there. So I stopped at a farm and had a little nap, and then I was fine. But I recognised that sign. I thought, gee, that's never happened to me before. But I did. I stopped, and I was better for it. We're going to continue this again in a minute. So have you got time?
Yeah, sure.
You've been listening to Business Class, presented by Eugenia Panterhos, founder of Business Class Collective. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcast, subscribe, rate and review this podcast. Share the love and let your family and friends know too. You can follow Business Class Collective on Instagram and Facebook. Join me next time.